Hi, I'm HernandezSolano, and I will talk about how socioeconomic and cultural roots create serial killers in Mexico and United States. First, what is the difference between a serial killer and a mass killer and a spree killer? The first difference and the most important is the serial killer have a, a cool down period to kill other people. The mass killer kill at least 3 people in one event, but the spree killer kills at least 3 people in different events, but in a short period of time. Remember, the serial killer kill in a lot in at least 3 events, at least 3 people, and have a cool period to continue killing. We have so why do serial killers emerge? The context matters. We have psychological factors. About the psychological factors, the serial killers uh, suffer physical, sexual, or emotional abuse as children. This trauma can express the normalize of violence. About the attachment disorders, lack of nurturing the relationships in early life may lead to antisocial behavior and desire to exert control over others. The psychopathic traits, lack of empathy and superficial charms and manipulativeness are common. For example, Ted Bundy. They have a need for dominance, thrill seeking for gratification through violence. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer. Sometimes we have psychosis in real conditions like schizophrenia and some neuropathies. There are some studies links the frontal lobe dysfunction where we have the impulse of control on, on the limbic systems, irregularities, emotional regulation to violent behavior. Now, let's talk about the socioeconomic conditions in the United States. The United States often internalize its as a land of opportunity, harbors a dark paradox, extremely well coexist with systemic failures that create a fertile ground for violent behavior, including including the, the serious killers, below which seek whole economic inequality, urban isolation, and mental health neglect intertwined to shape this phenomenon. The top 1% of Americans own the 32% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 50% hold just 2.6%. Over the 11% of the US population, we are talking about around 38 million people live below the poverty line. The poverty and lack of upward mobility breed frustration. For example, Aileen Wuornos, a homeless worker, killed clients out of economic despair and trauma from lifelong marginalization. And Bruce MacArthur, a fellow landscaper, targeted marginalized gay man in Toronto, compensating for his perceived social and financial failures. In US and of course in Mexico, we have the consumerist pressure, the myth of the American dream that exacerbates the shame and alienation. Serial killers, the Dennis Rader and Rodney Alcala, used violence to assert dominance in a society that equates success with self-worth. The loneliness epidemic, um, the cities in United States are building like as car-centric cities. For example, Los Angeles and Phoenix that lack communal spaces, foresting social disconnection. Or, a consequence of this, we have high mobility. For example, college towns and trucking routes allows predator like Robert Ben Rhodes, the drugstore killer, who exploit vulnerable individuals. In the actual society, we have the digital isolation. The social media replaces the real world connection, depending alienation. Incels like Elliot Rodger exemplify how online radicalization can escalate to violence. The 56% of incarcerated individuals have mental health disorders, but only the 43% receive treatment. This is because the therapy costs average $100 to $200 per hour, and 47% of Americans live in mental health professional shortage areas. Many serial killers exhibit antisocial personality traits worsened by lack of care. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer, who had alcoholism and necrophilic fantasies when undertreated despite multiple arrests. And we have Ed Kemper, who was released from psychiatric care despite warning signs of violent tendencies. The closure of mental health in the 80s left thousands underrated. For example, the vampire of Sacramento, the Richard Chase, who suffered schizophrenia and killed 6 people after being denied of hospitalization. And how this connect the poverty, he was trauma, and trauma he was violence. The economic stress exacerbates childhood abuse, a common threat among serial killers. The isolation plus mental illness, underrated disorders fester in socially disconnected environments, leading to violent fantasies. And of course, the consumerism as catalyst. The pressure to succeed in a hyper-competitive society drives some to lethal acts of control. About the cultural factors, the United States' cultural landscape stepped in midst of individualism, frontier justice, and male dominance, create a unique environment where predatory behavior is subtly normalized. Below we explore how media violence, gun fetishization, and systemic misogyny intersect to enable serial killers and violent offenders. About the entertainment industry, films like American Psycho, TV shows like Dexter, and video games like Grand Theft Auto romanticize anti heroes who use violence for power or justice. Podcasts, documentaries, and TikTok trends like Mindhunter turns killer like Ted Bundy into morbid celebrities, inspiring copycats and seeking notoriety. The digital radicalization, online forums, like, for example, incel communities, white supremacist platforms like 4chan, 8chan, and Reddit spread violence ideologies. For example, Dean and Roof, the Charleston shooter, they cited racist online propaganda as inspiration. In the land of freedom, we have more than 3,093 million firearms. It's around 120 guns per 100 people, the highest civilian gun ownership rate globally. The 60% of serial killers use firearms as their primary weapon. The second amendment methodology, the idealized link between guns, freedom, and masculinity. And this derives in fetishization of lethal power. Firearms symbolize dominance and recurring them in the fantasies of killers like Richard Ramirez, Night Stalker, who idolized the .22 revolver used in the dirty horror films, and Randy Woodfield, the I-5 killer, who targeted victims along highways armed with a handgun. The cultural norms, the root individualism. The American ideal of self-reliance often morphs into social atomization, distrust the community, and narcissism. This derivates in loneliness epidemic. The 58% of Americans report feeling lonely, creating a fertile ground for alienated individuals to nurture violent fantasies. This derivates in the lone wolf mentality. And of course, this fantasy about the alpha wolf, beta wolf. For example, predators like Ten Naczynski, the Una bomber, and Elliot Roger, the Isla Vista shooter, saw themselves as superior outcasts, justifying in punishing society. Neighborhoods like Ted Bundy's Tacoma or Jeffrey Dahmer's Milwaukee allow killers to hide behind a facade to normalcy. Key facts: the 70% of serial killers victims are women. The misogynistic tropes, media often portrays violence against women as titillating. For example, Law and Order, uh, where are episodes on focusing on sexy victims. The cultural drivers, toxic masculinity, social the U.S. Soviet pressure to dominate and dehumanize women. For example, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who targeted sex workers, viewing them as disposable. Robert Pinton from Canada murdered indigenous women, exploiting their systemic neglect of marginalized groups. The incels and men's rights movements in the online communities that blame women for male inadequacy fueling rage. Media plus guns. The violent films or games normalize the firearm use as a solution to conflict. The individualism and misogyny isolated men stepped in entitled target women to reclaim perceived lost power. For example, Patrick Sherrill, the postal killer, combined workplace resentment, gun access, and the media expired rage in a 1986 mass shooting that popularized the phrase going postal. Now let's talk about the Mexico's socioeconomic conditions. The Mexico socioeconomic landscape, marked by entrenched poverty, systemic corruption, and cartel dominance, create a permissive environment for serial violence. Below, we dissect how these intersecting forces enable predators to operate with alarming impunity. Case stats. The 43.9% of Mexicans live in poverty, with rates exceeding the 60% in rural states like Guerrero and Chiapas. The 7.4 million youth are between 15 and 29 years old are neither employed nor in education. We are called these young people like ninis, leaving them vulnerable to crime. Some studies, like Mexico Evalúa in 2023, said that the 1% of homicides solved compared to the 60% in the USA. The police collusion, the 90% of Mexican distrust law enforcement. This information is from INEGI in 2022, with officers often bribed or threatened by cartels. Killers like José Luis Calva, el caníbal de la Guerrero, operated for years due to botched investigations. The misclassification of crimes. The many serial killers are dismissed his crimes as cartel violence or domestic disputes. For example, feminicides in Ciudad Juarez, over 105,000 women murdered since 1993. Many cases ignored until activists demanded justice. The 70% of Mexico's municipalities are influenced by organized crime, who recruit young people These poor teens are lured into cartels with money and status, desensitizing them to violence. Independent killers mimic cartel brutality to intimidate or avoid detection. The cultural desensitization, like narco corridos, for example, drug ballads, and narcomantas, the cartel banners, glorify violence, blurring moral lines. El monstruo de Catepec, a father-daughter duo murder women in a Mexico City suburb. Their methods mirrored like cartel executions, yet authorities initially dismissed the crimes as domestic incidents. In Mexico, we doesn't have centralized database. Mexico lacks an equivalence to the FBI's BICAP, the BICAP, making it nearly impossible to link crime across states. The underfunded forensics, only the 12% of forensic labs meet international standards. The majority of these forensic labs are situated in City of Mexico. Unreported crimes, the families avoid authorities due to fear or futility. We have a lot of vulnerable population. Migrants, sex workers, individuals are targeted as their disappearances attract little. And let's talk about the cultural factors in Mexico. The Mexico's cultural landscape, shaped by patriarchal norms, cartel idolization, and fractured social structures, create a toxic environment where serial violence thrives. And below, we dissect how narco-culture and ritualized brutality intersect to normalize predatory behavior. The government by the ex-president Andrés Manuel López Obrador said that in 2023 we have 10 feminicides daily, but only the 5% of cases leading to convictions. The 66 of Mexican women report experiencing gender-based violence. By this information is provided by INEGI in 2022. The cultural roots. We have patriarchal power structures. Traditional gender roles enforce male dominance and female subjugation. The victim blaming, women who defy norms, for example, the working late, dressing provocatively, are seen as deserving punishment. How this linked to serial killing? The feminicide as control, the killers target women to assert dominance. For example, again, El Monstruo de Catepec, who murdered 20 women in Ciudad de Mexico, and many of one they were strangled and buried in their backyard. The narco culture. Narco corridos, ballads like El Corrido de Juanito, glorify cartel leaders as folk heroes, romanticizing violence. Narco cinema, films like El Infierno and El Chapo, a TV series, El Chapo, mythologize traffickers, inspiring copycat violence. In Mexico, we can see some people who venerate the ancestral tradition before the the colonizers arrives and replicates some rituals like practice like human sacrifice are disordered into modern brutality, mixing Catholicism with occultism. For example, el culto a la Santa Muerte justifies violence as spiritual protection. Of course, another mention, the santeros who sacrifice animals to protect favors, to searching favors and searching for protection. For example, we have Adolfo Constanzo's cult, who sacrificed victims in black magic rituals to empower drug lords. The 44% of Mexican children witness abuse at home, normalized aggression. This information is proportionated by UNICEF in 2023. Poor rural families often lack resources to address mental health or trauma. We, every generation have a generation trauma. Many killers, like Juana Barraza, endured childhood abuse and abandonment. The United the impact of serial killers in United States. The United States' unique infrastructure, technological advancement, and media landscape empower serial killers to act on their violent fantasies while evading detection. Below, we explore how mobility, technology, and media and media sensationalism shape the methods, motives, and longevity of American serial predators. United States have more than 40,000 miles of highways enable killers to hunt across jurisdictions, complicating the investigations. For example, the truck stop killer who murdered victims along the I-40 and I-70 highways to cross United States, exploiting his job as a long-haul trucker. Ted Bundy, who crossed 7 states, killing at least 30 women by leveraging regional police disconnects. College towns, tourist hubs, and homeless communities provide a steady stream of vulnerable targets. Another example, Samuel Little, who confessed to 93 murders targeting marginalized women in tracing-heavy areas like Las Vegas or Los Angeles. The technologic use hippos dual-edged innovation like digital forensics. The DNA databases named CODIS has solved more than 700 cases since 1994. I need to correct. There are more than 700 1,100 cases since 1994, including the identification of the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, via genetic genealogy. The surveillance tech is a license plate readers and facial recognition eye tracking. For example, capturing Israel keys via 8 AM cameras. Dark tech, like the dark web, platforms like Read Rooms or encrypt forums enable killers to share tactics. For example, Peter Scully, creator of Daisy's Destruction. The social media predators like Richard Beasley lured victims via Craigslist job ads in the Craigslist killer case. The sensationalism, the true crime documentaries like Conversation with a Killer, the Ted Bundy trap, and he posts the violent entertainment like video games like Manhunt, films like Natural Born Killers, and TV shows like Dexter blur reality and fiction. Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter, meticulously studied mass shooter manifestation and gaming forums. The podcast and like my favorite murder. This concept, these romanticize killers as anti-heroes. The impact of serial killers in Mexico. In Mexico, serial killers often operate in the shadows of a society overwhelmed by cartel brutality and institutional incompetence. The chaos created by organized crime, combined with systemic neglects, allow serial predators to evade detection for years, or even decades below. We dissect how this forces mass serial violence and enable killers to thrive. Cartels use extreme tactics like dismembered acid baths and mass graves that mirror serial killers' behavior, making it difficult to distinguish between cartel hits and independent serial crimes. For example, serial killers who was recruited by a cartel group, Santiago Mesa, El Pozolero, who dissolved more than 3,000 bodies for cartels, used techniques later adopted by unaffiliated killers. Authorities often demise dismembered bodies or missing persons as cartel related, ignoring potential serial patterns. For example, in La Fosa de Jalisco in 2021, the 157 bodies were found in clandestine graves, while most were linked to cartels investigators later identified at least 12 victims tied to a lone predator exploiting the chaos. Only only the 12% of Mexico's forensic lab meet international standards. Black Locket, The DNA testing delays justice for years. Unlike the FBI's Big Up, Mexico lacks a system to link crime across states, enabling mobile killers like Angel Maturino Resendiz, the railroad killer, to evade capture. Narco corridos, drug ballads, and narcomantas, the cartel banners, glorify violence, desensitizing communities to brutality. Fatalism, many Mexicans view violence as inevitable, reducing public pressure to solve crimes. Adolfo Constanzo, leader of the narco-satanicos cult, humored victims in ritual sacrifices to protect cartel operations. Local feared reporting him, assuming his crimes were cartel sanctioned. Of course, the serial killers will search the vulnerable population, for example, migrants. Over 5,000 across Mexico annually. Their disappearances are rarely investigated. In a lot of communities, the women in Mexico we have 10 feminicides daily, often mislabeled as domestic disputes rather than serial patterns. For example, El Monstruo de Catepec, they killed 20 women between 2012 and 2018. The authorities initially dismissed the deaths as lovers' quarrels. Now, how the United States responds? Uh, the United States has developed some of the world's most sophisticated systems for tracking and apprehending apprehending serial killers, combining the cutting-edge forensics and national databases and psychology profiling. Below, we break down the key tools and strategies that defines America's institutional response to serial predation. The CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, launched in 1994, is a national database which contains over 20 million offender profiles, 1.5 million arrestee profiles, 1 million forensic samples from crime scenes. The cold case breakthroughs solved the Golden State Killer, the Joseph D'Angelo, in 2018 via genetic genealogy, uploading crime scene DNA to public ancestry sites. Linked Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, to 49 murders after decades of evasions. The cross the this the CODIS permits the cross-state connections, matches crimes committed in different jurisdictions. For example, the Samuel Lils, the 93 victim spree across 19 states. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, the Big Up, created in 1985, is the FBI's repository for homicides, sexual assaults, missing person cases with suspicious circumstances, and use AA to detect modus operandi called by FBI MO links between cases, for example, the weapon choice, the victim type, geographic patterns, how was killed the victim. For example, identified Israel Keys, suspect by linking his Alaska murder to a Vermont cold case via MO similarities. The crime scene analysis classifies killers as organized, plight, planned, high control. For example, Ted Bundy. Disorganized, spontaneous, sloppy. For example, Richard Chase. The geographic profiling maps. This maps crime location to predict offender residence. For example, pinpointed Dennis Raiders, the BTK home radius. The famous cases, the Unabomber profiles predicted his Montana cabin hideout based on manifesto linguistics. The Atlanta child murders, behavioral analysis ruled out a random killer, leading to a Wayne Williams arrest. The positive role. Public Tips, America's most wanted helped capture John list after 18 years in hiding. Pressure on police, spotlighted on cases like Gabby Petito, forces resource allocation. Of course, we have negative roles. The copycat crimes like Ted Bundy television set trial inspires imitators. Sensationalism, glorification of killers like Jeffrey Dahmer's fuels morbid fascination. Now, the institutional responses in Mexico. Mexico's justice system is crippled by systemic failures that allow serial killers, cartels, and everyday criminals to operate with near total impunity. Below, we dissect the institutional root and leaves 45% of crimes solved and enables predators to thrive in the shadows. Mexico expend around 0.9% of the GDP on public security. Less than 5% of police budgets are allocated to investigating non-cartel crimes. The forensic neglect, only 12% of forensic labs meet basic standards, the UNDP. Black backlogs delay the DNA analysis for years, as seen in the Catepec serial killings, where victims remains when unidentified for months. We have outdated tools. The most states like ballistic databases or facial recognition tech, forcing detectives to really outdated methods. The cartel dominance, organized crime commits 70% of homicides, monopolizing the investigate resources. The police to population ratio, Mexico has around uh, 3,055 officers per 100,000 people. The UN recommends the 2022 to 3,000. Most are untrained for complex cases like serial killings. The misclassification killers like Juan Carlos Hernandez, El Caníbal de la Guerrero, evade capture for years because his victims, sex workers and immigrants, were dismissed as cartel casualties. The burnout, the detectives jungle 50 more than 50 cases simultaneously, leading to errors like mishandled evidence in the Monstruo de Catepec case. Of course, we have the police collusion. The 90% of Mexican distrust law enforcement. This information is provided by INEGI. The officers often leak case details to cartel or killers. For example, El Pozolero, body dissolver for cartels, briefed police to ignore his independent murders. The judicial bribes. Prosecutors accept payments to downgrade charges or lose evidence. For example, the Iguala mass disappearance. In 2014, the local police kidnapped 43 students and handed them to cartels. Federal investigators later revealed mayoral and police ties to drug gangs. We doesn't have a national database like FBI's pickup. Mexico has no system to link crime across states. The serial killers like Angel Maturino Resendiz, the railroad killer, exploited this gap. Victim blaming. The families of missing persons must investigate themselves. Over 1,100 disappearances remain are unresolved since 2006. The marginalized victims, feminicides, 10 women killed daily, yet only the 5% of feminicide cases result in convictions. Migrants over 500,000 gross yearly, their disappearances are really low. So at least we have some similarities. So the United States and Mexico, despite their cultural difference, share foundational issues that normalize violence, perpetuate inequality, and reinforce misogyny. Factors that contribute to environments where serial predation can flourish. Below, we explore this parallel through the lens of Hollywood and narcocorridos, two cultural phenomena that reflect and amplify social obsession with power, brutality, and gender oppression. United States, the economic polarization. The top 1% hold 32 of wealth, while 11% live in poverty marginalized groups. For example, Eurasian minorities, the working class, face systematic barriers to upward mobility. Uh, like case example, Bruce MacArthur, a failed landscaper targeted marginalized LGBTQ plus men in Toronto driven by economics and social alienation. In Mexico, the poverty trap. The poverty trap. The 43.9% live below the poverty line with real estates like Guerrero exceeding 60%. Lack of opportunities pushes youth toward cartels. For example, Juana Barraza, La Mataviejitas, a Western turned serial killer murdered elderly women for their possession and amid economic desperation. The Hollywood's role. Tropes of objectification films like Basic Instinct and Gone Girl erotize female suffering or frame women as disposable plot devices. The true crime glorification. Documentaries like Extremely Wicked show keenly, shockingly evil and vile romanticize killers like Ted Bundy, overshadowing their female victims. The narco corridos influence. Machismo in lyrics sounds like El Corrido de Juanito, glorified cartel leaders who dominate women, reinforcing patriarchal norms. The feminicide normalization. Over 10 feminicides daily in Mexico, often trivialized as crime of passion in media and music. The Hollywood's obsession, glamorizing anti-heroes, films like Joker and American Psycho humanize violent protagonists, blurring moral lines. Sensationalized true crime podcasts like My Favorite Murder turn real life tragedies into entertainment, risking destination. Narcocorridos, the celebrations culture myth-making songs like El Señor de los Cielos immortalize drug lords as folk heroes, framing violence as a path to power. The ritualized brutality, the cartel videos and narcomantas, the threat banners, publicize executions from normalizing extreme violence. In the United States, we have mental health neglect. The 56% of incarcerated individuals have untreated mental illness. The gun access, the 3,093 million firearms are in circulation, enabling impulsive and planned violence. In Mexico, the corruption, 90% of citizens disrupt police. The 45% of crimes go unsolved. The cartel collusion, institutions prioritize cartel-related crimes, ignoring serial killings, masked as ordinary violence. To emphasize and make some connection between a serial killer in Mexico and a serial killer in the United States, I give you two two cases, the ten Bondis and two El Pozolero. And later we have analyzed uh, so shortly the case of El Caníbal de la Guerrero. Okay, let's check the Ted Bundys, the American serial killer. Him psychological profile. Bundy exhibited narcissism, psychopathy, and traumatic childhood marked by secrecy about his parentage. Methods used charms to lure victims, targeted young women, and exploited interstate mobility to evade capture across 7 U.S. states. Motives driven by a desire for power, control, and sexual gratification rooted in deep-seated misogyny. The US context in 1970s. The law enforcement limited forensic technology, the pre-NDN era, And lack of literacy coordination allowed Bondi to exploit jurisdictional gaps. The media role sensationalized coverage turned Bondi into a macabre celebrity fueling public fascination and fear. The public perception view it as a monster, but also paradoxically romanticized due to his charisma and intelligence. And what about El Pozolero? The El Pozolero have a cartel association, work for the Tijuana cartel, dissolving more than 3,000 bodies in acid to erase evidence. Their methods industrial scale body disposal using caustic substance act, act as a cog in cartel operations. Their motives? Financial survival and coercion under cartel dominance, reflecting systemic violence in Mexico drug trade. The cartel influence operated in a climate where cartels rival state authority with corruption enabling impunity. Instead, the institutional challenges, um, underfunded forensic and published collusion allowed cartels to weaponize fear. The public perception, seen as a symbol of cartel brutality, yet his actions were normalized amid widespread drug war violence. Here we have an abstract to compare, to check the the difference and similarities with Ted Bundy's and El Pozolero. The transnational implications, the institutional weakness, the both cases highlight gaps in law enforcement jurisdiction in US and system corruption in Mexico. The cultural complicity, media glorification in US, and normalization of violence in Mexico enable criminal legacies. The cross-border crime, cartels and serial killers exploit weak international cooperation. For example, Bondi fled to Florida while cartels operate transnationally. The policy recommendations. The US enhanced interagency databases like BICAP and address misogynistic cultural narratives. In Mexico, combat corruption via independent tribunals and invest in forensic infrastructure. So, what challenges and solutions here the US government and the Mexico government? United States, the first, the challenges. The mental health access. Over the 50% of incarcerated individuals have untreated mental illness. Stigma and cost barriers prevent early intervention. Only the 43% of adults with mental illness receive care. The institutional weakness, the backup underuse. Only the 1% of law enforcement agencies contribute to the FBI's crime database. The forensic black logs, more than 100,000 untested rape kits delay justice. Solutions: expand healthcare access, fund a community mental health clinics, and integrate screenings into schools and workplaces. For example, uh, 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline expansion in 2022 reduced the emergency calls to police by 50%. Strengthened institutions. Mandate backup, participation, and allocate funds to clear DNA blacklogs. Train police in mental health crisis response. For example, the CAHOOTS program in Oregon. The challenges in Mexico: the systemic corruption, the 95% of crime go unsolved. The police often collude with cartels. The cartel influence: the cartel controls 70% of municipalities, normalizing violence and intimidating investigators. Resource deficits: forensic lab meet only 12% of international standards. Solutions: the anti-corruption reforms, establishing independent tribunals, increasing police salaries and enforce accountability via body cameras, combat the cartels, expand the national guard's role in high-risk regions, investing in financial intelligence to disrupt cartels' economies, and forensic modernization. Partner with international agencies to upgrade labs and train analysts. To finalize this presentation, I will talk about the comparative between El Caníbal de la Guerrero and the Milwaukee Butcher. The both have similar criminological profiles based on studies and interviews with psychologists, criminalists, and experts from the PGJDF or la Procuraduría General de la Justicia del entonces Distrito Federal. They conclude that the lack of love during his childhood, the lack of understanding, mistreatment, frustration, and sexual abuse shaped José Luis Calva Cepeda's psychopathic personality, and they even compare him to Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Butcher. Both Dahmer and Calva Cepeda were alcoholics, antisocial, isolated, very close off, and homosexual. The Milwaukee Butcher had various sexual fantasies of sodomy. He practiced various sexual positions with his victims. He thought that by hurting his victim, he would add greater sexual pleasure. He looked for young people who liked them, that they would agree immediately that they were thin so they could be manipulated. As for Jose Luis Calva, his favorite book was The Days of Sodom and Gomorrah by the Marquis de Sade. He wanted to fulfill those types of fantasies, but he couldn't. He even forced one of his partners to engage in those practices. According to criminologist Patricia Payan, one need that they psychopaths have is to seek increasingly strong emotions. Oh, I can uh, put the video. So they are criminals who improve themselves. They start with small offensive until they commit more atrocious crimes. Maybe it could be a little lie. Uh, they become a DF to have some in the store. The specialist specifies that as the psychopaths plan their crimes, they plan their sexual behavior in their minds. However, there is always a detail missing, and that is uh, why they look for more victims, but their fantasy is never fulfilled. Regarding Calva Cepeda's similarity to the Milwaukee's butcher, Bayan. Okay, it's ready. Uh, okay. Payan clarified that the latter made precise cuts as if they had been made by a surgeon and was intimate with his partner at his ranch. He was very calm when the authorities went to his home to ask about a missing woman. They discovered a body hanging by the legs and mutilated. There were okay. There were human remains all over the place. As will be recalled, Calva Cepeda was arrested, drugged out on October 8 in 2007 in his apartment where his victim's dismembered body was discovered. Jeffrey Dahmer also consumed some of his victims' viscera. He hired homosexual women he killed and then mutilated, and he even took their body parts, and take pleasure with them. This behavior is interpreted as a desire to have power, to exercise total and absolute dominance over another. The victims are objects, and it is desire that they lose their identity. In addition, he studied anatomy and analyzed a pygmy tribe that engaged in acts of cannibalism. As for their cannibal of Guerrero, as a frying pan with meat and a piece of bone were found on the stove in his kitchen. In the dining room, there was a plate with the remains of burned human flesh and some cutlery, a squeezed lemon peel, a jar of Valentina sauce, a kitchen lighter, a bottle of rum, and a can of beer. His partners had a pattern. They were short, divorced, single mothers whose children represented a weak point on which they could gain leverage. When they began living with them, they also live with their children in this way. In this way, they managed to manipulate them since they threatened uh, to harm the little ones. Another similarity between the cannibal and the butcher is the veneration of death. Dahmer said, I'm fascinated by that. He came to want to dominate his victims. He drugged them, performed brain surgeries to turn them into zombies. He claimed that he was the greatest, that he was God. Okay. For his part, Calva Cepeda was fascinated by the study of death. He said he was a Christian. Okay, I think. Okay, he was a Christian, and that by mutilating his victims, he prevented them from reaching heaven. In other words, he believed himself to be God. In his writings and in the drawings found in his house, the cannibal of Guerrero described himself as the most important creation in the universe. Likewise, Calva Cepeda and Dahmer were accused of sexual abuse and theft. Both were self-centered, which annoyed people and drove them away from them. Calva Cepeda didn't like being alone, but he couldn't tolerate being with anyone. If his pattern started making demands of him, he would get tired. When she left him, he would immediately look for someone else. In conclusion, Dahmer and Calva Cepeda shared an antisocial personality disorders. Their crimes became increasingly violent. They were highly dangerous people. Patricia Payan explained that in prisons, psychopaths are given psychological treatment, but it's not enough because they'll never change. They can deceive you. They won't reveal it themselves because it's a chemical issue. They have okay. They suffer from a malfunction of the amygdala, which regulates emotions. So far, there is no antidote. So treatments for psychopaths are not advisable. She said that in a penitentiary, they adhere to the rules and respect authority. They pose no danger to the rest of the inmates. Um, what there won't be is a rehabilitation. They will always be in danger to society. If they leave before their sentence, they will continue to commit homicides. According to a criminological study, Martin Barros Cruz, a researcher at the Institute of Penal Sciences, concluded that José Luis Calva met certain characteristics of various murderers and compared him to Jeffrey Dahmer. Okay, him to Jeffrey Dahmer, no. Okay, uh, the Luis Calva met certain characteristics of various murderers and compared him to Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Butcher. He will, if we compare a serial killer like Sergio Aranda or Jose Luis Calva, we will find some similar elements. acts of cannibalism, alcoholism, drug addiction, antisocial behavior, drugs, and temptation of death, says the specialist. In contrast to in USA, the Kennedy health minister from President by who works by President Trump said that the autistic childs break break families because they can produce, they can work. Um, this is uh, clearly intention, clearly signal to the serial killers in USA and the mass killers and spree killers in USA. They will be continuous. At least the government institutions competent themselves to change the economic model. Of course, we have the fentanyl problem in all big cities in the United States, and they can they can see and they can do is criminalize and take the weight of the responsibility to other countries like China, like Mexico, and they don't interested to make a greater society because this affect the production growth, and they prefer to maintain their society below the drugs. Meanwhile, they can make money. In Mexico, we have a problem with characters like the match. When, for example, in this video, they say, "Oh, the women only can stay in home. They need to clean, clean the house and take or take care for our child because I take cares for her and I love the women and and he and him and his followers doesn't can see how the women like Mao Zedong said the women sustain the whole of the sky. They can see more than their noses, and they can see how the Second World War was the civilizatory accomplishment. The hyper-productive model economic and the social pressure over the society makes the radicalized men to separate to contrast to women only can express their uh, feelings in explosive in explosive expressions like we can see in this video. And and in this video we can see.
Oveja descarriada. ¿Ya te diste cuenta que le diste las flores y no le interesan?
We can see.
Se las acabas de dar y ya las arrumbó. Inviértete en ti, bro. Revísale su celular. Revísale y verás que habla con muchos. Tú igual. Oveja descarriada. Voy a ver una pregunta de cómo te la hicieron.
You are inverting yourself. No give flowers.
Son para la novia.
Surely
¿Te puedo dar un
your
consejo, bro?
girlfriend
Millonario.
stay with other men.
Inviértete en ti, bro. Inviértete en ti, bro.
What happened when this kind of people
con eso vas camino a tu perdición. A la morra se le va a estimular la hipergamia.
Drugs effect,
se le estimula la hipergamia, le va a tomar foto para subirle que la ve electro.
¿Sí
o no?
Revísale
el celular, bro.
Chemical issue.
Yo lo conozco.
They can only express
¿No se llama Brittany?
his feelings in.
¿Sientes bonito llevar a la novia, va? Vergüenza se debería de sentir, güey.
They can't know. They doesn't want feels knows another points of view. So, like José Alfredo Díaz Escobar, head of the Central Persecutors Office for Homicides in City of Mexico, said the homicides aren't the people who commit homicides aren't normal people. They lost their instinct. They aren't measured. They have a violent emotion state. The normal people always say in the margin. And to finalize this presentation, this site is the most correct to end. That said, he who wants fight with monsters should be careful lest he thereby becomes a monster. And if you gaze long into abyss, the abyss will also into thee. This is the bibliography for this presentation. Thank you so much for seeing 1 hour and a half video. Thanks.